YouTube live stream of our class today. As it is close to Tisha B'Av, we're going to talk a little bit about Tisha B'Av, and we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in Israel. Tisha B'Av starts tonight, obviously, and it's a little bit of a repeat for who've been on the line already. It is the day we mourn the destruction of the first and second temple and a wide variety of other tragedies, including the end of the Bar Kokhba revolution or revolt. It is the only other full fast day on the calendar besides Yom Kippur. Excuse me for 1 second. You guys need me for anything? Bob, do you need me?
Oh, you're on your class, aren't you?
I'm in my class, but is it an emergency? Okay. Alan and Bob say hi to everybody.
Keep on learning from the rabbi.
So if you go to services for Tisha B'Av, you sit lower as if you're mourning. You read from the Book of Lamentations. You don't wear leather for some. So it's a day of mourning. And of course, in Israel, for a lot of people, it's
talk a little bit about Tisha B'Av.
It's a day of mourning as well.
About what's going on in Israel.
So how many of you have been able to keep up online a little bit about the protests? And we'll go over a little bit about what they're about. We mentioned it previously. But these are the biggest protests in the history of Israel, which is going to be 75 years old next year, right? No, 75 years old this year. It's 75 this year. Of course, it is this year. So we'll talk a little bit about it. And we'll first have to go through the structure of the government. Now, first of all, Israel does not have a constitution, which is a major deal, because obviously that means the laws can be changed a little bit easier. Secondly, Israel does not have a division between all three sections of government. In the U.S., we have the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. In Israel, the legislative and the executive are together. You vote for a party, whichever party can create the coalition, then they control the legislative and the executive. So right now, Benjamin Netanyahu is the prime minister, and his coalition, you need to have at least 61 to be a coalition. So what does that mean? In the Knesset, in the Israeli government, they only have one house. There are 120 seats. You get a seat by how many votes you get. If you control 61, that means you run the government. That means you can do anything you want as long as everybody on your votes. So Netanyahu has a 64 majority. So they control the legislative and the executive branch, which is always the case. If you're the prime minister, you control the legislative branch. The Supreme Court is chosen by another group that really is not beholden to the Knesset. There's a very complicated way of doing it. We talked about last time. What the Supreme Court is now being challenged with is Netanyahu and his legislative branch want to change the rules where they can overrule the Supreme Court anytime they want, basically. So by creating a law that says that's undesirable or whatever they call it. And so this is what's just started. The first of many votes was just enacted. And so the process is now started where the Supreme Court will lose its power in terms of the legislative and so basically anything the Supreme Court, once these laws are finished, and they will be voted in, obviously, because they have a majority, once they're in, the executive branch basically has total power over Israel because they control the legislative and will control or be able to veto any Supreme Court ruling. Added to this, and it may make a difference or not, is that Netanyahu is, of course, facing corruption charges and bribery, and not bribery, I forgot the name of the word. Basically, he is possibly going to court, which, of course, if he is able to veto any legislation, he can make sure he's not convicted. So these are the issues. Now, what is happening is that in the last election, a very right-wing government was elected. Some people are very right here, some are left, I know. But the right in Israel is not like the right in America, because it concludes the religious parties. So let me show you how the vote went last time. Oops. And if you have any questions or thoughts, let me know. So here's the vote last time. So you can see that Likud right here. Do this. Come on, there we go. So, there you go. So Likud, religious Zionism, Shas, United Torah Judaism, and let's see, it's 7 or Shas. Okay, so these are 4 of the main parties that created so they have 32 and 14 is 46, 46 and 11 is 57, and 7 is 64. So these are the 4 parties that control Israel now. So this means that the groups that are very religious have kind of control over the party, because if one of these groups leaves, then the government will fall. So if you have 61 people in your government and one party with a few members decides to leave, the government falls. So these 4, Benjamin Netanyahu is required to make sure the other 3 parties get what they want, or else they will make the government fall. And that's how it always is in Israel. And so, any questions so far?
Yeah.
Yes, Ron.
Unless I'm wrong, isn't this the first time that the military is against Netanyahu?
Yes, that's what we're going to get to right now. So what we're seeing now is something new. The protests have engulfed the country in a way that they never have before. That means there are people who are past military leaders, current military leaders, companies are now saying they will not, they're protesting. So that means people who are supposed to go into the army in Israel, you serve in the army every month. Once you finish your service, you go every month. I mean, once a year, you go for a month. So lots of people are saying we're not going to go serve, which has never happened before. They have people all over the place who are protesting. They've had hundreds of thousands of people protest. And of course, Israel is a very tiny country. They're protesting not the government, but the government's attempt to basically take control of the Supreme Court. And so what you're seeing is this historic group of protests, which has now been going on for months, is just getting louder and louder as opposed to getting quieter and quieter. A lot has to do with the fact that it's all far-right parties. That one, they have also put some very controversial leaders into powers to very big political positions. These are groups like the ultra-Orthodox who want more money, who do not work and do not support the country. Basically, they're paid to have kids, they're paid to study Torah, and so they're a very big drain on the government. Plus, they do not teach their children, their women, they don't teach the women to read and write. They don't teach them anything about computers or anything in the modern world, so they have no skills. So you have this 10% or 8% of the people who have no skills at all, who treat their women very terribly, and who these people are not allowed out. So they're basically, and so the government now is doubling or giving a lot more money to these groups. So basically, if you're ultra Orthodox in Israel, you get paid not to work. You get paid to have kids. But that puts a strain on everybody else whose tax rate is like 45% because you also have to pay a lot for the military and for obviously medical. So this group of people that doesn't work is growing and getting more money. The group that is very anti-Palestinian is now in a position of power, and we're talking about the far right people who will be happy to just do some terrible things. So they're in power too. So that's part of the issue, is this far right. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu is basically the least right person in his government right now. He is the lefty in his government. And so those are big issues, but the major issue is this overhaul of the Supreme Court. And if you read, obviously, the major newspapers in Israel yesterday or the day before had a giant page headline with a blank space, just black space. It said a black day for Israel in Hebrew, and you saw all these. And so the question is, what is going to happen now? Now, some people might say, well, Netanyahu would never do anything that would cause strife for the government. He just wants to fix the Supreme Court, which other people have had issues with. The problem is, once you create an institution where one person can be in total control, what happens when somebody is not a very good person takes control? I mean, it's an unlikely possibility, but what if they say when the next election comes around that we don't think there needs to be an election? What if they say and that, the Supreme Court arrests or, some of these lawmakers, several of who have already gone to jail for various things, are now in government. What if they are doing something illegal and the Supreme Court doesn't have the power to prosecute them? What happens when violence against Palestinians gets really extreme and the Israeli leadership is supporting it as opposed to denouncing it? Right now, there are not only military people who are protesting, but also the healthcare system. You have hospitals that say they'll go on strike, except for those that are in dire need. You have the labor union who is promoting these things, saying it may promote strikes as well. You have people who are calling Netanyahu a dictator now. If that's true, it's not true, but that is certainly something that may happen in the future. Any questions or thoughts? Ron?
Yeah, from what I'm gathering from this and what I've been thinking, watching the news and everything, it seems to me that it's getting closer to perhaps an overthrow of the Netanyahu regime.
Well, that's an interesting thing. Will that happen? I don't know. The protests have been pretty peaceful. I don't know if Israel's gotten to that point yet, but it may be something that will happen in the future. Who knows? Right now, if there was an election, the other side would probably win, but there's not going to be an election for a couple of years. What happened in the last election is the other side really made some terrible mistakes in the election, which ruined their chances. So in Israel, what they basically did is, in Israel, you vote for a party. You don't vote for an individual. You vote for a party. So let's say we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's eight screens right now on. So there's 8 parties. So what the other side did was said, go ahead and vote for smaller parties. So let's say Sam and I and Noel and Ron and Arlene, we voted for smaller parties. The parties, though, did not get enough votes to get into the Knesset. That means our votes are now null and void. Because it's like they need about, I forgot the percentage, they need a certain amount of votes to get at least 2 seats in Knesset. So if we all voted for a small party, that didn't get in Knesset, our votes were wasted. And so all of these groups voted for small parties that did not get in Knesset, so their votes were wasted. That's why the other side was able to win. It was really a terrible mistake on one side. But again, the protests are not because of the Palestinians, although that's part of it. It's not just because of Netanyahu's, possibly going to court. It's because of the overthrow of the Supreme Court, and people know what the consequence of that in the future. Now, the current government can say, no, 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 we're just trying to overhaul the Supreme Court. We're not going to do anything. But that doesn't mean they don't have the ability to do something. I mean, they now can do something if they want. So once this is finished, they'll have a lot more power. Larry.
Yeah, Rabbi, as you know, we're in New Jersey, and I've been getting a tremendous number of emails from our other fellow congregants of different organizations, and each one of the rabbis has, come out pretty much with an analysis of it. The problem that I have is that the end of the analysis ends up with, let us pray.
Right.
I'm wondering, we are Jews in diaspora here, but we still have quite a bit of leverage against, not against, but I mean to say what we want to as Jews in diaspora. What can we as a Jewish community do to express our dissatisfaction? I've written to several of these congregations and I've told them I'd like to see some, letter writing to the Israeli embassy or unified approach. And some of it has been done. I've seen some unified letters from different Jewish organizations, but what are your thoughts on that? What can we do to exert pressure?
We do whatever we can. Again, we have some limits here because obviously we don't live in the country, but I would say send money to organizations that are not supporting this or protesting this. Letter writing campaigns, Facebook, it all helps. Again, showing support to all the organizations that are doing these things, writing letters to the Knesset members who are probably most likely to listen about the issues.
Are the HUC rabbis or anybody, are they putting together any kind of a letter that we could sign on to?
I think that's a good idea. I think they have, so I'll look for that as well.
If you could forward any of that information to us.
That's a good idea.
If Mikveh Israel is doing anything as a unified.
Well, we should be, you're right, we probably should do some of this as well. But in Israel, I mean, obviously in Israel, if hundreds of thousands of people are protesting and nothing's happening yet, there seems to be even more pressure exerted. You're right.
Yeah, I would think of external pressure from American organizations, even
and I think that's a good idea to ask American, to put pressure on American organizations that would, I think that's an excellent idea.
The Orthodox in Israel, they don't even consider us as being Jewish. Do they really care what we say, or if we write letters to these organizations? I don't think so.
Well, you don't need to write it to those. I mean, some Orthodox are fine and some are not. I mean, the ultra-Orthodox are different than the modern Orthodox. But I mean, there's also the religious Zionists. I mean, the non-religious Likud members. Those are the ones who obviously fear what's going to happen. There's others who don't care at all. So those are the ones you write. You don't write to extremists. I mean, there's just no reason to do that. But I mean, again, we're looking at it from one perspective. From their perspective, they're made different things. So, but the real issue is the Supreme Court. That's why the protests that's why they've gotten so big. They're not if they hadn't gone after the Supreme Court, these protests would be very minimal, I think. Because not everybody is against the views of the different things, but the second biggest issue is now what used to be the biggest issue was the ultra-Orthodox and the fact that they're growing and not not helping the economy. That's the long-term issue that's everybody's been worried about, is what happens when this group reaches 15% and 20% and 25%, and all of a sudden you're supporting half the country who doesn't work. People are just going to leave. Companies are going to leave. Nobody wants to do that. But that has taken a backseat to this new move with the Supreme Court, which is really Israel's fault in the first place that they didn't solidify this with some sort of constitution. I mean, the mere fact that a vote of the Knesset can do this to the Supreme Court tells you that for the last 75 years, people have just assumed that nobody would ever do this. They didn't actually put it into law. And they didn't make it impossible to do, because all it's taking to change the law is a majority of the Knesset, and every single government has a majority of the Knesset. Like for 75 years, if you wanted to be in charge, you had to have a majority. That meant any prime minister over the last 75 years could have done this, and nobody did. And it wasn't, and now we realize it wasn't because they weren't allowed to, it was because they were, thought it was, reprehensible to do so. Larry.
Yeah, as I understand it, part of the argument is under what they call this reasonable doctrine.
Right.
And without a constitution, the court rules on what they think is reasonable. Now, could you give us a little background? How is the court comprised? And how do they judge what they think is reasonable? Like, in other words, we have a Supreme Court here, and our Supreme Court changes based on, the political appointees of that Supreme Court, apparently. And, the reasonableness is a very fuzzy argument. And but how do what do they use as reasonableness?
Well, you have to remember, it's, if you use reasonable, like the Supreme Court uses legal aspects, it's can the parliament overturn the court over unreasonable because of reason. And that's what's going on here.
But how is the court comprised?
The court is comprised, and again, the court is not comprised like it is in the US. In the US, we have a system where, you're elected, you're voted in, and it's got to be voted on, and there's discussions, but that's because you have two different parts of government working together. Where in Israel, it is a third entity entirely, and that's how it's made up. It's made up of people who are put on the court by third parties. There are 15 judges, and there are 2, I think, deputy judges or registrars, and they go through a very different policy where, so basically you have a group that is the people in charge of appointing them. So there's a committee appointed by the president of Israel. So the president of Israel is a non-political position. It is basically just a, what do we call it? It's a ceremonial position for the most part. But he creates a committee which is composed of members of the Supreme Court, a couple of cabinet ministers, 2 Knesset members, I think, members of the Israeli Bar Association. And this committee then selects the Supreme Court. So you need a overwhelming majority of these, I think 7 out of the 9 committee members have to, and also, if you're going to be in the Supreme Court, by the way, there are certain requirements. You have to have been a judge or a lawyer for so many years and practice. So it's not like the US where anybody can be put on it. If they're elected Israel, you have to meet these standards. So this third party committee, in which the prime minister of Israel has no parts, except for 2 cabinet ministers. So what Netanyahu wants is to have the prime minister in charge of not only overturning Supreme Court decisions, but in the future selecting Supreme Court justices. So as in America. Now, the difference is in America, the Supreme Court would be selected by the president and the
Approved by the Senate.
to the Senate, so the legislative and the executive branch, which is sometimes the same and sometimes not. In Israel, it's always connected. Michael.
Yeah, one of the things though about reasonable is our courts consider reasonableness also in the context of the law and the regulation. Is the executive implementing the law on a reasonable basis? The difference here is that the court, they're saying the court can't look at it. And that gives the executive branch a carte blanche. In our system, if the court says it's not reasonable, the argument is always, well, Congress can pass a law to make it reasonable. So we're able to override Supreme Court decisions that, sometimes are inherently bad or wrong. If there's a political consensus, but in Israel, that's not going to happen because of the way the government is structured,
Right.
and so that makes it very, in my opinion, very dangerous. And then when they get to the second part of the judicial reforms, it's going to give the government, and it doesn't matter whether it's a right government, a left government, it's going to give the prime minister absolute authority to make decisions.
And that is what people fear. I mean, and the fact that, again, it has never been done before, even though we see now that it could have been done before, because it's really easy to pass.
Yeah.
I mean, if you control any government could have done it if they had agreement, and so it's really strange that it's kind of like we've seen in America in recent years, that we thought there were laws for presidents, and we realized they weren't laws, they were traditions. And it's the same thing in Israel. The tradition has been, do not touch the Supreme Court, but it's never been a law. And so that's what we're seeing now. For Israelis, obviously, we'll see what happens. But for us as Americans, what do we do? I mean, do we continue to support Israel as a country? Or what do? We don't visit Israel? Don't spend our money there? But that, of course, does that hurt the government or does that hurt the people? Do you still support Israel even though you don't support the policies of a government, kind of like what happens here in America if we don't support the government? We support the policy, we don't support the policies, so that means we don't support the government itself. Is that something that we want to do? Now, we're going on a trip next year to Israel, which is a great place to visit. We don't, but do we stop being supportive because of this change? What do you guys think?
Well, I think that we really have to keep supporting Israel. First of all, they're our only real ally in that whole area. And we need them as much as they need us. So yes, I think we have to support them, regardless of what their beliefs are as far as the Supreme Court and everything.
Now, on the other side of the coin, sorry, Jane?
I was going to say, on the other side of the coin is, if you're supporting their policies, you're against the people.
Yeah, again, that's the question, is how do we support Israel without necessarily supporting everything they do, which is always the question. It's like
we
America.
have a history. We have a history of supporting non-democratic governments because of what we call our self-interest. And if you look over history, those things have failed dismally.
Yeah.
supporting those governments. I mean, sooner or later, the shining light in the Middle East has always been Israel because it's a democracy. And that's been one of the major arguments that they've been able to pull together in the US Congress, despite differences, that they are a democracy in the Middle East and they are this one shining light. And that's why we support them. As they move further and further away from a democracy, I mean, do you still continue to support them as we do, let's say like Saudi Arabia and things like that, but it's a different kind of a support. So it's a very, it's a razor's edge. It's a very difficult argument. I think there should be a withdrawal of some support. I'm not saying it's like as broad-based as this economic sanctions on Israel, but I think we as Americans should show our dissatisfaction. And I think this has been brewing a long time with the, differences in reform versus conservative versus orthodox in Israel. And I think this is really coming to a head.
Michael?
Well, I mean, I think, Larry, you're right. The problem, as I see it, is that, and this isn't an original idea, but long term, Israel's going to have to make a decision. Will it be a democracy or will it be a Jewish state? Because the rabbi was talking about the demographics before, and in 40, 50 years, the Haredi, will overwhelm the country, and there's still going to be an Arab minority that currently has full, pretty much full rights. So will it, will the change in the demographics really lead to a non-democratic but Jewish state of Israel? And is this the beginning of it? And you can argue, I suppose, that it is, because you have this relatively small faction that basically is controlling Netanyahu because he wants to stay in power. If he does something that they don't like, they can walk and there'll be another election. And, he's going to lose another election if they have it now. And he doesn't want that for a lot of reasons. So it's a real conundrum, I think. You support the people, but certainly not the government. And what can you do to show your dissatisfaction?
Well, I think also whenever you don't donate money, make sure you're not donating it to groups you don't know of. Sometimes when you're donating money, it goes to places you don't realize. Jane?
What bothers me also is right now, at least in my mind, Israel stands for a refuge for people, Jewish people, who can't find a place to live. And who knows, maybe in years to come, we will have to use that as a refuge. And we're not considered Jewish by the ultra-Orthodox. I don't know what we're considered, to be very honest with you, because they'll say, oh, if your father was Jewish, then you're not Jewish. If your mother wasn't Jewish, they'll, it's like when the people of Black people, where were they from? Ethiopia. I mean, you had to prove something that you were Jewish. I don't understand that. You are what you're brought up, what you believe in. It's more than just saying, I inherited this. But that bothers me about having a government that's related to religion. Of course, unless it's my religion, no. But, it's kind of scary to me where we're going. And the way the United States is going, there's so much anti-Semitism right now, and we're burying it, kind of. There's no other place that really cares.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. I think the changes they can make to the law of return, which you're talking about, there's changes they can make to gay rights, women's rights. I mean, these are all things that are probably possibly going to happen. And so, but also if they're voted out the next time, then the next government can change it back or change to other things. And also they're setting a precedent where governments in the future can also make wholesale changes that nobody thought they would do previously as well. So this is an instance, it could be a turning point in Israel one way or the other. Israel has kind of ignored the issue of the ultra-Orthodox for years. They've ignored the issue of a lack of the Constitution for years. So we'll see what happens if these massive protests have an effect or if the government just ignores them as they're doing right now. We will see how it goes. But again, supporting a country despite turmoil or their elected officials is important because we do the same in America. We support the country, but we don't necessarily always like the people who have been voted into power, Larry.
Yeah, the Israeli security is really at risk here. That is really the real problem in my mind, because there's even rumblings that you hear from Jordan now, where there are groups in Jordan that are saying, let's reconsider the peace treaty that we have with Israel. And I wouldn't be surprised if, if those things, if they take advantage, of what they perceive to be a weakness now, and, just using these as trigger points for added violence and, let's just reconsider our whole relationship with Israel.
Which would be ironic because all these other countries are dictatorships much already. We're not going to be peace with Israel because of what they're doing in the Supreme Court in their own country. They do things much worse. It's one of those ironies. But we'll see. I mean, who knows what's going to happen in the future?
It was so hopeful with the Abraham Accords, that it looked like there was going to be a widening, if anything, of Israel's relationships with the other countries. And the fear years ago was the Arabs going to be populating and overpopulating. Right. And how quickly that has turned on its head now to be the ultra-Orthodox.
Yeah, I think it's one of those fears people have had and just kept putting it in the back of their mind, saying the next generation will deal with it. But as their numbers grow, that changes things quite a bit. And when you have people who are willing to take the government in exchange for giving over power in certain areas, which is what's happened. If you look at who's the head of, the different, aspects. So if we go right now I just would pick this on Wikipedia earlier. So right here you have, the current, so you've got Shas, which is a very ultra-Orthodox, where he is in charge of all of these major areas, including health, and they don't necessarily all believe in doctors. The Interior, Aryeh Deri, they put him in the area, even though he's been a convicted felon and had agreed never to take a position again, but yet he was put in this several positions before the Supreme Court said no, he'll probably be put back in. You've got the Minister of Finance, who is a radical. You've got Minister of Education is a Shas member, which is very ironic because they're not big on regular education. Their education is all religious. And then, of course, most controversially, the Minister of Security is a very right-wing extremist, Ben-Gvir, who has said very often some really nasty things and is willing to do a lot of terrible things. So this is where we are today. So hopefully things will change for the better in the future. But, politics in Israel changes pretty quickly. But just the fact that you see Shas in charge as a vice prime minister, minister of the Interior, minister of health, and that you see Smotrich as the minister of finance and the minister of education, somebody from Shas, and Ben-Gvir as the national security. It's a very scary thing.
I really wonder whether or not Netanyahu intended it to go this far. I think that he possibly, obviously he wanted to stay in power, and one of the reasons to be cynical was because of his own personal security here and not going to jail, or because of the charges against him and things of that nature, and maybe he can overturn those. like maybe our former president is hoping to do if he ever gets elected again. But it just seems to me that I'm wondering whether or not he has a fallback position here. Where has he gone too far? Has he passed his Rubicon, so to speak, and has he gotten too many of the opposition in his, it had become
His
really
cabinet.
not, the cabinet has now become so overwhelmed in the deals that he's made. It's reminiscent of the Kevin McCarthy thing in my mind here in the United States. And sometimes you go too far and you appease a few people, and then you keep appeasing and appeasing and appeasing. And I'm wondering if he's looking for a deal here where he could get immunity and then maybe try to regain control of some of the more liberal parties as well.
Well, he definitely wants a deal for immunity. He's immune if he's prime minister, but once he's no longer prime minister, he's not. So that's definitely what he's said he wants. Yeah, again, who knows if he wanted to go this far or what's going on. I mean, he's gotten more and more rights as time has gone on. And so there's a lot of different people think he's doing a lot of different things, some intentionally, some over his head. Some think he's finally gotten to the point where he always wanted to get. So we'll see. His family is traditionally very far right wing, not religious, but far right wing politically. But we'll see what happens. They're also going to they've already voted on the Supreme Court's ability to say that a prime minister is not mentally fit for the job. That's already been taken. They've already passed that, I think, in the last one. So. And the Supreme Court says they will not vote down what the Knesset has just done. So we'll see if they decide to change their mind later. I mean, this is going to be a process that's going to take a while. But if you see hundreds of thousands of people in Israel protesting, that's, and they're not, you see protests all the time for more money or for different things, but not like a political protest. They've never seen anything like this. So we'll see if it's been relatively nonviolent so far. But hopefully that'll stay the same. But as I said, this is Israel. You never know what's going to happen tomorrow politically. Any thoughts or questions?
Yeah, just keep us updated.
Yeah, I think it's still going to be a great place to visit. I know people were just there during the protests, and it's peaceful protests. And who knows, we may have been blowing this all out of proportion, but we may not have. So. The funny thing is that the Supreme Court rarely votes down anything the Knesset does. It just doesn't happen very often, apparently. So, but we will possibly see rights of gays and lesbians start to fall, women's rights as well. Those are two big ones we know that may happen. Money increasing to the ultra-Orthodox. Very small possibility of annexing completely and taking, not just annexing, but making the West Bank part of Israel, taking rights away from Arabs who live in Israel. I mean, these are all possibilities.
And,
So we'll
and
see.
the protests are becoming more violent. I mean,
they just started becoming a little bit. But also that was a lot of the right wingers attacking the Palestinians, and the Palestinians attacking the right wingers as well. So.
Yeah, and the
But also-
reservists, of course, the reservists are.
Yeah, and also they just had Jerusalem Day, the crazy right wingers marched through Jerusalem into the Arab quarter and protest. And so there's nothing wrong with being on the right, but there's certain, these are extremists. All right. So good talk. Very positive. I feel like we've just
Very good.
uplifted everybody. But let's, again, check the news because they just started these votes, and we'll see. They had protests. It stopped Netanyahu. There was negotiations. They failed completely. The president has to actually sign these accords, which is just ceremonial, but he may refuse. Ron?
Yeah, what Larry said about Jordan. If Jordan does not renew the peace accord, I mean, is Netanyahu aware that Israel will have to stand alone in that area?
he looks at the way he's this very cagey, smart politician. He sees the world as that these countries don't care what goes on inside Israel, and so that's what he's banking on. Because all of these countries are very fearful of Iran, and he's banking on the fact that they're more scared of Iran than anybody else.
But he's got to be aware of the economic impact of this, where companies are threatening to leave Israel, and technology is threatening to leave Israel, and the brain drain away from Israel, and you don't want to inherit a country that is basically going from a first world technology country now into a third world country.
Yeah, and so that's what people are wondering if he's going to. Usually you'd think he would care about these things. We'll see. There's one thing about protesting. There's another thing about doing if one or two companies leave. But if lots of them leave, lots of reservists don't serve, and they've had like 100 past military leaders write letters, so protesting. So who knows what's going to happen? Sure makes it interesting though. You never know what's going to happen, huh?
There was a very interesting column. I don't remember. I think it was Krugman in the Times. Wrote a column about American aid to Israel, and his thesis was you don't want to end it right away, but Israel is so advanced and their per capita income is so high relative even to a lot of European countries, that they really don't need it anymore. And I'm not an economist. I don't know whether they do or they don't. But it's to me the aid itself is symbolic of our support. And once we reducing that, we're losing support of Israel in the United States. And I think that would be an awful thing for a lot of reasons.
I agree.
And especially in this era where anti-Semitism is on the rise, kind of like what Jane was talking about earlier.
I agree. Does he care? Who knows? I mean, there's
tax rates in Israel are very high, and
yeah.
You can't continue to support a country that has fewer and fewer workforce that's contributing to the tax structure. I mean, it just is, it's destined to collapse. I mean, they've got to recognize that.
I know, but it's very easy to say, if it's going to happen next year, that's one thing, but this is going to happen in 50 years.
Yeah.
So you can always say, it'll be fixed in the future. Or why worry about it now?
We have plenty to worry about in this country, that's for sure.
Yeah, we're still worried about this country too. Well, excellent. Thanks, guys. So we will not have a class next week, and then we'll be doing Kabbalah for starting the second week of August. Anybody have any exciting plans coming up?
Yeah. The second week of August, August 9th, will be my 91st birthday.
Happy birthday, Ron. What are you going to do to celebrate?
Well, we'll think of something.
Okay.
Jane and
Larry, when you guys?
Well, we have our 60th wedding anniversary next week, and we're going up to, we're in New Jersey, of course, but we're going up to the Berkshires for a few days. And
very nice.
Mazel tov.
Yeah.
Have a great time. We look forward to seeing you guys when you get back.
Larry, you're lucky you have such a nice looking bride.
That was his first wife.
He was married for 60 years to her too. He's 182. Looks good.
Like Abraham.
Well, guys, enjoy. We will see you in 2 weeks. Some of you hopefully will see at services. And we got a lot going on. We got, of course, Seersucker Shabbat coming up, and the welcome back party, and we just had a lot of sisterhood stuff. And so see you guys at some of the stuff. Anything you need, give me a call.
Take care, everybody. Stay well.
Stay safe, everybody. Thanks for joining us on the class that shall not be named.